Our topic for today is a little bit of a strange one for an ethics course. It's knowing oneself and deceiving others. The first part is traditional, going all the way back to the oracle at Delphi, know thyself. But the other part, deceive others, that's a little interesting and sounds to a lot of ears as if it's kind of unethical. It's key, however, to strategy in situations of conflict, situations of pure competition, warfare. And so in those situations, you really do want to understand yourself. You want to understand your own tendencies, your own strengths, your own weaknesses. You want to keep those things from the enemy. You don't want them to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. You don't want them to understand you or the situation. And we'll talk much more about that later. So here's the key idea. It's one of the fundamental ideas in Sun Tzu's Art of War, and it's something that does seem to be fundamental in understanding any situation, like those situations of pure conflict, where cooperation is basically impossible, and where the only available strategies are likely to be mixed strategies, strategies where you have to keep the opponent guessing. The point is precisely to keep your opponent guessing. Now, I think there are a lot of situations in life that are like that. Not just warfare, literal or metaphorical. There are situations of pure conflict where, for example, you're in a situation of buying or selling something. You're negotiating over the price of a car or the price of a house. There, every dollar in the seller's pocket is coming out of the buyer's pocket. And so it's a situation of pure competition. And just as in other situations like that, in these kinds of negotiations, it's important to not let your opponent know exactly what your maximum price is, for example, or your minimum sales price if you're the seller. And so in situations like that, or lots of situations of business negotiations, of bargaining, it's important to keep your cards hidden. There is a certain discussion in business ethics about whether bluffing in the context of negotiations, bargaining, is morally acceptable and under what circumstances. There's a lot to be said, I think, about the ethics of negotiation and in general strategies of negotiation. I won't try to say anything about it here. But it is a situation where it's important to know oneself, but also to deceive others. It seems to me vital in those situations that one is trying to keep certain information hidden. Well, much more so in situations of direct conflict like those involved in warfare. So let's talk about Sun Tzu's ideas about knowing oneself and deceiving others. All warfare, Sun Tzu says, is based on deception. In war, practice dissimulation. You want to deceive the other party. You don't want them to know what you're doing. You don't want them to understand your tendencies. You don't want them to understand where your weak spots are. Sun Tzu gives more detailed advice. When we're able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we're near, we must make the enemy believe we're far. When far away, we must make him believe we're near. There are interesting aspects to all of those. We want to deceive the enemy about our own capacities, about our own activities, about what we're doing. We want to deceive them about our proximity. And here it might mean literal proximity, like we don't want the enemy to know where our army or our navy is. But there's another aspect of it that's applicable more broadly. We don't want the enemy to know what we're thinking about, to know what we're focusing on, to know where our attention lies, to know what we're about to do. We want to keep not only our general tendencies hidden from the enemy, we want to make our plans hidden from the enemy. So we want to make sure that what we have in mind is something that the enemy does not understand, and we've got to keep from revealing it. Hold out baits to entice the enemy, Sun Tzu says. Feign disorder and crush him. We want to have our act together, but seem not to. Seem to be acting randomly so the enemy cannot understand what our plan is. If he is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he's in superior strength, evade him. In other words, fight when it's to your advantage to fight. Pick your battles. Pick the battles where you can win. If the enemy is stronger there, avoid the fight. Don't venture into battle. Stay away. Here's one of my favorites. If your enemy is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. In other words, where strong, seem weak. Where you're weak, seem strong. You want to deceive your enemy about your own strengths and weaknesses. So it's very important to cover up those weaknesses, appear strong there, but also cover up the strengths. Don't let the enemy see exactly where you're least vulnerable. Try to tempt them to attacking you where you're strong. So hide your strengths too. And seek to irritate the irritable enemy. After all, when somebody's angry, when they're upset, they're not going to be able to think as clearly. So if you've got an enemy who's easily upset him, poke him, okay? Conversely, however, if you've got an enemy who's hard to anger, don't waste your energy trying to do it. Try to adapt to the strengths and weaknesses of your enemy. If he's taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. If your enemy is getting tired, keep at it. Keep exhausting him. Make him give up the will to fight. If he's unified, try to divide and conquer. Try to split the enemy apart. Try to create conflict, disharmony. Again, we're going to talk much more about that later. It's a key element of what Boyd refers to as moral conflict. But it's a question of not only dividing forces in a literal way, but trying to induce uncertainty, trying to induce conflict on the part of the enemy. Attack him where he's unprepared. Appear where you're not expected. Try to do the least expected thing. Try to strike the enemy where they're not anticipating it. After all, it's partly a question of strengths and weaknesses in a more constant sense, but it's partly a question of what people are expecting you to do. So if you start understanding what the enemy thinks you're about to do, you have a great advantage, because you can then do something else. In other words, appear to be one way, appear to be following one plan, in fact be following another plan. These military devices, which lead to victory, must not be divulged beforehand. So that too is key. Don't let the enemy know what you're up to. Your adversary is going to be trying to obstruct your plans. Don't let the enemy know what those plans are. Keep your plans a secret. Try to deceive the enemy about your aims, but also about your plan for getting there and the tactics you plan to use in implementing that strategy. Well, so far it sounds like this is advice about fighting, but actually it's advice about how to win without fighting. The highest general is the one who wins without fighting at all. Sun Tzu says the highest form of generalship is to balk the enemy's plans. In other words, to confuse the enemy's plans, to defeat them, not to let the enemy accomplish what they want to accomplish. The next best is to prevent the junction of the enemy's forces, to keep the enemy divided, in other words. The next is to attack the enemy's army in the field. And the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities. The best plan is to disrupt the enemy's plans, not to let them accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. The second best plan is to divide and conquer, to create tension, to create conflict on the part of the enemy. The next best is to attack. It's really not a very good plan. That's when you're out of other options. You ideally want to tilt the playing field in your favor so that you attack only when you're guaranteed victory. In other words, the worst thing to do, well, it's not to actually attack when you're uncertain of victory. That's bad, though. That's a sign of weakness. That's a sign you're in trouble. If then you end up laying siege to walled cities, in other words, you're attacking the enemy where they're strongest, that's the worst possible option. Why? Well, partly because your chances of success are not that high, unless conditions really are favorable to you. But part of the problem, too, is that that kind of long-term siege is difficult on both sides. It weakens both sides. In general, you want to strike quickly, you want to win quickly. Long, protracted conflict hurts everybody. There are victories that end up harming you as much as they harm the enemy. So you don't want to be involved in that kind of conflict. Now, if we put all of this in an institutional setting and think, what does this mean for someone who is within an organization, a company, for example, or a non-profit or a university, as opposed to somebody who's literally in the field, in the military? I think all of these have important implications in those settings too. If we've got institutional opponents and we're trying to defeat them, the best thing to try to do is to disrupt their plans, to keep them from attaining their objectives. The second best, well, to create confusion, tension, conflict on their side. Don't let them unify. Don't let them achieve harmony against you. Instead, try to keep them divided. It is worse to come into direct conflict. You may win, but you may not. It's a dangerous thing to do unless you know that things are heavily in your favor and know at the outset you're going to win. But finally, the worst thing to do is to, well, besiege walled cities. In other words, it may be that your opponents within the institution really have very firm control over something. To attack that is going to be extremely difficult, and it's likely to end up being really costly to both sides. You may wish you had never started the fight, even if in the end you win. So, better not to do that. Try to win without fighting. Try to outmaneuver your enemy. Try to outmaneuver the opponent without coming into direct conflict. This is the best strategy within an organization, as well as on the field of battle. So Sun Tzu says there are 5 keys to victory. First of all, you've got to know when to fight and when not to fight. Pick your battles. That is important in any sort of setting, not just in the military. It's really important to know when to fight and when to say, look, I think I'm right about this, but it's not worth the fight. I don't want to alienate an enemy. I don't want to push away the people who are persuadable and could be on my side. It's too costly. So pick your battles. Know when you should fight, know when not to fight. Secondly, know how to handle both superior and inferior forces. When things are on your side, know how to manage that situation. But also when things are tending against you, know how to manage that situation. Sometimes you're going to be stronger than the other side. Good. Know what to do about that. Know how to exploit it. But at other times you're going to be weaker. And recognize that too and know how to deal with that situation. It's going to happen. Third, animate your forces by the same spirit throughout all the ranks. That is to say, make sure your side is on the same page. Get your people in line. Keep your coalition together. It's going to be important that you all agree about things, that you all know what one another is doing, that you, in short, have your act together. So animate your people with the same spirit. That is to say, make sure you're all on the same page, keep your spirits up, make sure everybody within your group understands what you're trying to do, and make sure they're inspired to follow. Fourth, prepare and take the enemy unprepared. So you've got to prepare yourself, but then wait for the opportunity where the opposing side is unprepared, and then attack. So it's important to recognize when the moment comes for you to seize your advantage. You can win big by choosing the right moment. You can also lose big by choosing the wrong moment. So it's important to be patient, just as the batter has to wait for the right pitch in baseball. So you have to wait for the right situation to make your move. Finally, develop your own military capacity, but avoid interference by the sovereign. This seems to me really important, not only in the military, but in any kind of institutional conflict situation. You want to develop your own capacities, develop your own leadership abilities. And so work on yourself. It's part of knowing yourself. Don't just know yourself, oh, well, I'm pretty weak and not a very good leader. Work on yourself. Try to develop your own capacities, your own abilities. So make yourself a better you. But also, be careful. Avoid imperial entanglements. Your higher-ups can mess up your plans. And that's true in any organization where there's anybody above you. So be careful about that. The people above in an organization can disrupt your plans, whatever they are. And so you've got to try to avoid interference. Now, sometimes that's inevitable. But basically, the best thing for a political leader to do, for example, when it comes to military conflicts, is to allow the military people to do their jobs. Similarly, often the best thing for the CEO to do is to allow the people to whom various authorities have been delegated within the organization to do their thing, to do their job. Now, it's important that people not just go off and run off in tangents in many different directions, but still, micromanaging is a mistake. And so the way to put this, in a sense, is, look, here is one thing that can disrupt your success in an institution or on the battlefield. That kind of micromanaging from people above you. One of the reasons that warfare on the Western Front in World War I was so destructive is that the people making the decisions and micromanaging to the point of insisting upon an attack on a given day and so on were miles from the front lines. They weren't there looking at the barbed wire. They weren't there in the trenches hearing the bombardment or the shelling. They were miles behind, sitting in tents, or in some cases back in London or back in Paris. And they were giving the orders, not just in general that, well, we want to make a motion in general in this part of the line, blah, 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 but instead saying, okay, your unit, attack today at 9 o'clock. There can be, under certain circumstances, reasons to do that kind of thing, but they were constantly trying to preempt the decision-making of people actually in the field. Now, that was terrible because they did not understand what was going on. It was also terrible because communication was poor. And even if the idea was they were supposed to be giving effective commands and then receiving information and so on, there were all sorts of battles that were lost during the First World War on both sides because there was a breakthrough. People achieved an objective faster than expected and then couldn't get orders from headquarters and weren't authorized to make decisions apart from those orders. So in many bureaucratic organizations, the problem isn't so much active interference, it's that everything requires so many layers of approval. Those approvals take so long that in the end, you can't make any decisions on the field below. And at that point, if you don't have the authority to make decisions and to act, well, it's pretty hard to put your capacity to win into action and actually do it. I think there are several key observations that Sun Tzu makes that we ought to take note of here. A good leader wins battles by making no mistakes. Now, we've seen making no mistakes can't guarantee victory. After all, you've got to hope that circumstances are favorable and that the person on the other side does make mistakes. But you can at least try to ensure yourself against defeat in this way. Don't make any mistakes. And wait for those opportunities that circumstances or a mistake by the opponent affords you. The victorious strategist only seeks battle after victory has been won. We've already talked about that. Pick your battles and wait until the advantage is on your side. In fact, strategize, prepare in such a way that all you have to do is implement the plan and you win. So set things up in advance and don't make your move until you can be assured of victory. An important one. When you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Don't press a desperate foe too hard. You want to be careful to leave your opponent some way out. After all, an adversary who thinks they have nothing further to lose is going to be willing to fight as hard as they possibly can. You really want to destroy the will of the enemy to fight. And so don't back them to the wall. Don't put them in a situation where they have no choice but to fight. The fighting is destructive for both of you. Even if you win, you're going to emerge with some wounds from that fight. Your ideal, your goal is to win without fighting. So leave the adversary a way out. Don't trap them. Don't make it so that they have nothing else to lose and will fight no matter what. Try to make them give up the will to fight. And nothing will encourage their will to fight better than putting them in a desperate situation. That brings me to the last bit of practical advice, which is to understand the different kinds of grounds. Try to understand, in other words, the different kinds of circumstances you find yourself in. In most of them, it is not going to be to your advantage to fight. But on desperate ground, sometimes that's translated as on death ground, fight. because there are times when your back is against the wall, where you have no choice. Then recognize that situation. Recognize when this is desperate. My only chance for survival is fighting. Then fight. That can be true in the military, but it's also true in other organizational settings. When you realize my back is against the wall here, I'm trapped, I have nothing to do but to fight my way out, then fight. Ordinarily, you don't want to fight in other circumstances, but when you're trapped, when you've got no other choice, recognize that situation. Recognize you've got nothing more to lose, and then fight. I'll close with this famous passage from The Art of War. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you'll also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you'll succumb in every battle. Half the equation here is knowing yourself. The other half is knowing the enemy. But of course, turn it around and think about this from the point of view of the enemy. Suppose the enemy is filled with self-knowledge too. Then it comes down to a contest between your knowledge of the enemy and their knowledge of you. And so in that contest, you might say, look, if I know the enemy well, good, I'll win that conflict. I will not go down to defeat. But be careful, because you want to make sure that they don't understand you. It's important to understand yourself, important to understand them, but also to try to keep them from understanding themselves. Try to disrupt their thinking, try to disrupt their way of proceeding. And finally, try to keep them from knowing you. The secret to success isn't just knowing yourself and knowing your enemy. It's deceiving your enemy about who you are and what you're up to.